Thanks everyone. Thanks, Carl. That was an amazing start to LCT 3.5 and an incredibly hard act to follow. So actually, I would like to start off. I'm just going to share my slides with you, introduce you to my colleagues today, and then we are going to get started. So let me just get my slides up. Okay, so our session is called Powerful Praxis, Making LCT Work in the Classrooms. And this is LCT Singapore. So that's myself, Namali Tilakaratna, and my colleagues, Mark, Brooke. So Mark, can you wave at everyone? And I will be presenting on behalf of Laetitia Monbec, who's the third member of our group in Singapore. So we've been working really closely together. We all work at the same center, the Center for English Language Communication at the National University of Singapore. And we've been working with LCT on a number of different projects. And we also apply it to our teaching. So today we're really interested in looking at how sharing some of the ways in which we use LCT in the classrooms and actually operationalize some of these theories in terms of actual activities that we use and that we thought were successful. So just to let you know a little bit about ourselves. So I'm a senior lecturer at CLC and I teach a CLIL unit, which is Content and Language Integrated Learning, and on nations and nationalism. So I'm going to share with you some of the activities that I do with my students there. And I'm also coordinating a unit, a very large unit for engineering and design with Laetitia. So I have published in LCT, Systemic Functional Linguistics, and I'm currently co-editing a book with Dr. Esther Senesh. So we'll be talking about that a little bit more in the book launch, which is, I think, session number 41 on Thursday. So if you want to come along to that and see some of the work we've done. So Mark, Laetitia, and myself also contribute to that book in collaboration with lots of other scholars from all over the world, some of whom I can see here today. I know we're sort of crossing some strange and interesting time zones. I actually wanted to know, who do we have in this session? Oh, we have all 63 participants. When Lee was asking everyone to introduce themselves, it would be great to hear where you are all from, and please say hello in the chat. That would be nice to have a little bit of interaction before we get into a little bit more in terms of the sessions. So Mark, would you like to introduce yourself briefly? Just say hi to everyone.
Sure. Hello, everybody. So I work with Namala on a similar type of module, a CLIL module. Mine focuses on sports sociology, and I'll be sharing with you some of the activities I do with students to help to teach them to write theoretical framework sections for a social science research paper.
And then the final presentation is, which I'll be giving, which is from Laetitia's work, which was her PhD on English for academic purposes. And she basically looks at how to create a cumulative curriculum using semantics. She's published in Systemic Functional Linguistics and Legitimation Code Theory as well. And she does a lot on EAP. She's currently, I think it's a research member, a head of research at Bali. So she's been working a lot on English for academic purposes, and I'm going to show you how she uses it to look at her curriculum and cumulative learning in one of the sessions. So we will be getting you to participate, which is going to be interesting, I think, because there's so many of you here today. So we do have an interactive element. So when we're going to actually make you use some of the activities that we have planned for you today. So I'm hoping that you all join in. So today's focus, why is LCT a game changer for the classrooms? I'm going to be looking at axiological clusters to build resistant text reading. So I'm going to be looking at, and Carl just distracted me by casually, never mind. Okay, I'll keep going.
Sorry,
so
I didn't mean to distract you, Nomi. I'll turn my video off if you like.
No, please don't. It's nice to have someone, no, don't do that, Carl. Come back and distract me. It's much more interesting than having it, like you said, the black box of Zoom presentations. And yeah, so I'll start off axiological clusters. I'm just going to look at how I actually use it in my classrooms. It's incredibly powerful. My students love it. I just teach it to them in a very simple way, and then they use it in their own assignments to analyze text, to analyze multimodal text with images in it. So I'll be looking at that. And then I will look at some of Laetitia's work on how she uses semantics to look at curriculum. And then Mark will be presenting on his social science module on sports sociology and using semantics as well. So just to get started, so axiological clusters is what I'll be looking at today. And I'm going to just tell you a little bit about my unit. So my unit is called What is a Nation? And it's a content and language integrated module as part of the residential colleges at NUS. So we have small classes of like 16 students each, and we teach them both content, so concepts of nations and nationalisms in relation to my specific topic and module. And then we also look at how we can understand how these concepts of nations and nationalisms are realized as imagined communities and constructed through image and language interactions. So I'll show you lots of examples of that. So in order to understand image language interactions, I look at multimodal discourse analysis. So I introduce bits and pieces of Crescent Van Leeuwen and other frameworks to explore how language and image construes national identity in text. So Singaporean students, just to give you an idea of the context, and I'm sure Mark will back me up on this, are not ESL students. They're not an EFL background. We're very much working in a country where the students are already really proficient in English and extremely well educated, usually topping all the international test scores. So they're incredibly smart and very, very good in their English. So we're not really teaching them English, we're teaching them academic literacy, and we can really push them to the next level when we introduce frameworks to them, because usually they can apply them and use them straight away, and then they can use them in their own assignments very effectively. Some of their material, actually, a lot of our colleagues publish with students in journals, in many journals, Discourse in Society, for instance, and Mark has published with his students as well. So because many of them have such high quality work that can easily be turned into academic papers. And these are first year undergraduates. So it's quite a, I think it's quite challenging to teach them, but also incredibly rewarding. So what we teach in the unit in the first level, so I'm looking at the first level, that it generally spans across 2 years or 2 semesters. So the first level of ideas and exposition modules is about creating an expository essay on a topic of interest to the students. And Mark will talk about the IMRD papers, which is the next level of research papers that students write. So just in general, all of the modules, in addition to being about content, nations and nationalisms, it's also about, you know, teaching students academic literacy skills. How do authors argue in favor of a certain position, comparing oppositional positions. So these are the kinds of overall aims of the course that are given to us by the course coordinators. And there are about, at any given time, about 10 different units in IEM, and students can choose which ones they want to join in. So the one that I'm looking at is Singaporean nationalism. Extremely challenging because Singapore is, what do you call it, an authoritarian democratic state. They are interesting in that they have one sort of a dominant ruling party, the People's Association Party. And they, even though they consider themselves having a hybrid identity, so they like to think of themselves as the country where anyone can come and live and work, no matter which part of the world they're from, and feel at home. They speak English, and English is one of their main languages. They also align with Asian values. So just to use one of the famous sort of political scientists, historians who's been working on Singapore nationalism for years, he makes this distinction, and here comes the typical dichotomies that Carl's talking about, that there's an ideological confrontation between individualistic Western influences and wholesome communitarian Eastern traditions. And in our course, we're trying to see how these kinds of oppositions are realized in the kinds of texts that we look at. So individual and individualism in opposition to collective well-being and communitarianism. So right throughout school, all of the media, all of the kinds of textbooks and the language and the ideology that students are introduced to is this idea of Eastern communitarianism, privileging the collective, and the individual is supposed to work on behalf of the collective. And the concept of self-sacrifice is what's very much sort of encouraged. So this is a country that has, for instance, national service. So 2 years of every male Singaporean adult will be dedicated to national service. So there's a heavily nationalistic focus. So in my course, I try to get students to analyze this, but of course, if you look at larger theories of nationalism, such as, Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined communities, or Partha Chatterjee's idea of anti-colonial nationalisms, they tend to be at a very abstract level. So to allow students to look at texts and how they create national identities, I give them little frameworks. And one of the ones I'm going to be looking at today is axiological constellations. So what kind of texts do we look at? Many, many, many different types of texts, political speeches. We look at a lot of image texts that use image and language. So for instance, the SARS posters from when SARS was at its peak in Singapore in the early 2000s. And then we look at things like, so Singapore, just to be very specific, is called by one of the academics who works here, Michelle Lazar, she calls it Campaign City, very well known for having sort of nationalistic campaigns which attempt to try and regulate citizen behavior and encourage people to behave in a way that's preferred by the Singaporean government. So, there's a lot of information and a lot of images that my students are exposed to day in and day out that are nationalistic in meaning. And part of the challenge of the course is to try and make them depersonalize that, become aware of what's happening, but also look at it from a much more sort of critical angle, and to try and think about it as systematically something that they can analyze. And this is where LCT becomes really interesting. So I'm trying to create this concept of building resistant text reading. So critical literacy in students, I want them to become the skeptical other. And so being the other means that they move from, being a compliant reader, so someone who reads a particular message like, wear masks, and then follows that particular message, for instance, to asking about the underlying social reasoning behind it, the way that the text tries to compel you to do it, how the text is arguing that it's the best thing to do, and how that positions them in relation to communitarian values that are sort of lauded by the Singaporean government. So students are empowered to become resistant readers and to try and avoid naturalized reading positions. In other words, not to just read the text and take it for granted, but to ask about all of the meanings that are built into the text. And one of the ways that we try to do this is with axiology and axiological clusters. Hi, Carl, welcome back. Okay, so one of the questions that I'm really asking, I think also, is the fact that so much of critical thinking research is quite vague about what actual classroom practices you can use to teach students these concepts like analysis. So analysis is a big word in university, but there's very rarely satisfactory explanations of what can you do in the classroom to actually make students analyze texts. What does that actually mean? What kinds of frameworks can you use? And certain theories require a considerable amount of knowledge and time invested. So I'm talking about 12 weeks, and by week 4, I want my students to be able to start analyzing texts and using that for presentations, for developing their own topics, etc. So I need to get to the analysis of concepts pretty quickly. So I'm going to show you how I go about doing that. So I'm using clusters and constellations, and I'm I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because I'm presuming that most of you are quite familiar with Carl's idea of clustering as clustering of ideas, practices, beliefs, and attributes, and the associations together or in contrast with other clusters. So as you can see, even in terms of the larger cosmology of what constitutes Singaporean nationalism, you have this idea of already a dichotomy appearing in terms of the West versus the East, and Western individualism versus communitarianism. So I'm going to look at one of the texts that one of my students brought in as one of their assignments and analyzed it using clusters, and then how I developed that into an activity. Okay, so here we go. This is what I'm going to be doing. I'm very briefly asking my student this question. So I'm just drawing on the concept of axiological clusters that Esther and I were looking at in relation to a previous publication that we did. And one of the questions that I ask my students is, when you're looking at text, just find any instance of evaluation, something is positive or something is negative, and then try to think about who or what is it evaluating and how is that charged? Is it negatively charged or positively charged? And do it intuitively before we start to see the overall emerging patterns. So patterns that would emerge, for instance, if we see more than one instance of a Singaporean woman, for instance, being judged for not wearing a mask, then I ask the students, all right, okay, so you're now starting to see a cluster emerging. So there you have certain types of meanings, negative meanings being associated with this one participant in the text. And then how does that evolve from that point onwards? What other clusters are they associated with or opposed to? And then how does that develop into a larger constellation? So, okay, let me just show you, sorry about that. All right, so this is the text that I'm using. And I'm just going to escape my presentation just to let you know that I do have a Google Doc for this activity. I'm not sure whether we can actually manage this with 57 participants, but it would be amazing if some of you could just jump into this Google Doc and just have a look at the activity that I've got there. So this is exactly what I would do in class. I would give my students a Google Doc like this, and the Google Doc would have the text in it. And I would just tell them, all of you in the class together, you can go about just highlighting any instance that you think is positive or negative in this particular text. And they would start to mark it up pretty quickly. And then I would give them a table. So you can see in the Google Doc, let me just go to that and show you what I mean. There's also, can you see my Google Doc? Am I sharing the right screen? Yeah, okay, so you can see a table. I would also give them a table and I'd say, okay, if you are comfortable, and guys, please feel free. Oh, thank you. There's an anonymous raccoon in there, very helpfully logging in. Feel free to mark up the text. That would be amazing. I'll give you a few minutes to do it if you like.
Sorry, Namali, did you say? Did you ask whether you were sharing the screen of the Google Doc? You're not.
Yep. Am I sharing the Google Doc screen?
No, not on Zoom.
Okay, let me just go back. Sorry, then I'm still sharing my. Okay, I can see people are already marking up.
If anybody wants to know, the link to the Google Doc is in chat, everyone. There you go.
Thank you. Do you want, have I put it on the chat? I have. Okay, sometimes I think I'm very clever at Zoom and then I'm not as clever as I imagine I am. So yeah, so today it's okay. So just, yep, anything that you think of as being negative, absolutely anything. Okay, so concepts like, right, exactly. So arrested, didn't obey the rules. I'll give you a few minutes to do this, refusing to obey instructions, lovely. Okay, so just while you are marking up the text, I'm just going to scroll down and show you how then I would get the students to start thinking about what is the evaluation, just to list it, and then think about what is being evaluated. So if it's a negative meaning associated with allegedly attacked, who is that meaning sort of, what is that meaning targeting or evaluating? So then I would say, for instance, okay, the Singaporean woman and her actions are perceived negatively in this text because she is allegedly attacking a person. You see that there's, after a while, if you can feel free to add into that table as well, if anybody would like to do that. This is a great class. Everyone is participating. Thank you. This is amazing. Yep, sovereign is a really interesting one. So my students will pick that up and then there will be one of those moments where they're like, hang on, is that negative? Well, certainly being sort of swept up in the wave of negative clusters here that are forming, right? So you can see that, yes, in this instance, it is taking on a negative evaluative meaning. Nice. Okay, refuse to cooperate, reject government, reject police, or any kind of authority. So, yep, thank you. Yep. So I would then at that point just point out that, so buying food at a stall is what she's doing, but of course it's still the Singaporean woman who is being negatively evaluated. It's her behavior that's considered negative. Thank you, anonymous Lima. Yeah. She, yep. So accumulating, refusing to obey instructions. Okay, someone has put me in there. I've been included, great class, positive. I would put refusing to obey instructions into this box. And then it would still be the Singaporean woman. So we can see, for instance, we're starting to build up a whole host of negative meanings that are starting to emerge in this text. Just give you guys just a few more seconds, a few more. Okay, so some of you may have noticed in this text something interesting is going on, all right? So initially you've got she, all of the things associated with this woman. So this was someone who declared herself sovereign and said she's not going to wear a mask because she doesn't belong to Singapore and she won't obey the rules. So in Singapore, not wearing a mask, for those of you who are from parts of the world where this may not be the case, in Singapore, you get fined for not wearing a mask, and safe distancing ambassadors or SG Clean ambassadors are essentially civilians and volunteers who are sort of being mobilized as I guess, a kind of police force, in the sense that they go around telling people you're standing too close together. They go and tell bars there are too many people with their masks off, and they can give you fines and they can have you arrested, or they can basically make you accountable for what your actions are according to the law. So in Singapore, there are quite harsh penalties in relation to mask wearing, safe distancing, and whether you're following the rules. We're still in a state where we're only allowed to have 5 people at home at any given time, or be in a group of 5 when we go out to eat, for instance. So all of these measures have sort of underlying rules behind it, and fines that are put in place to ensure that people are following the rules. But of course, what you see happening is all of these meanings: arrested, do not obey the rules, the woman is refusing to obey instructions, saying she's sovereign, that incident, refused to wear mask, aggressive, asked her to leave, not observing safe distance, refused to cooperate, right? Multiple meanings accumulating for the woman. And as one of you has beautifully pointed out, there's some sort of a shift that happens in the text where suddenly we have a new meaning coming, those who do not obey the rules. So she starts to constitute a group of people. And that group of people are the people who consider themselves to be sovereign. And then it's related to, in this particular part of the text, there is a movement in the US and adherence to that movement. So all I would do is, while my students are doing this task, it's a very simple one: positive meanings, negative meanings, who is it targeting? I would shift them. And if there's anything that they're doing that's not correct, I would move that on the table. But I would also constantly keep talking through, yep, loads of negative invoked meanings. Yep, absolutely, yeah. So there's so much of it that is implied, but also students can intuitively pick up on that, which is kind of interesting because they'll automatically see that. And of course, what's interesting, sorry, Billy, do you have a question?
Hi, hello.
Hey, Billy.
Hi. I'm just really interested in the way this is developing. And in particularly that last thing you were highlighting, which was the movement in the US that rejects the police and the government. And that's really interesting, the way it rejects both, in a sense, right-wing and left-wing kind of US individualism.
Yeah.
So that was very interesting. But I mean,
Yeah.
the question I've been wanting to ask for a bit, is, okay, you developing this critical literacy. Is your critical literacy that you're developing not exactly this kind of individualism that your state wants to reject? And therefore, how much do your university management, get jittery when you start doing this kind of thing?
Okay. So that's an interesting question. I think to a great extent what I do to get around that, there is definitely that. There are, for instance, there's a lot of rhetoric about not being overtly political. And so in order to avoid that, what I would do is I always make them read academics. So Chua Beng Huat, whose work that I showed you, which talks about Western individualism and Singaporean communitarianism, that's a very famous academic, Singaporean academic working in NUS at the moment. So that's one way of getting around it, which is to show students that they can go to work, which explains what's happening here. I wouldn't necessarily start with giving them that dichotomy and showing them that dichotomy exists and then showing them the text. I would just let them come to that conclusion themselves through their own reading. And of course, I would point them to people who are, he was if I'm not mistaken, he was the chair professor, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, one of the deans, I think, as well. So he's very, very prominent name. So aligning yourself with the views of those kinds of academics, and then showing the students the potential to understand texts that are functioning in Singaporean society at the moment through the lens of those kinds of academics, is just giving them literature that already exists rather than teaching them a particular way of seeing Singaporean nationalism. So I don't actually explicitly tell them this is one way of looking at it or another. I'm just saying these are the possibilities that texts can reveal, and I'm teaching you to be aware of those possibilities. They're brilliant students. They are already aware of those possibilities. As soon as they read any of these texts, the minute they look at, if they even Google the concept of communitarianism, Chua's work is going to come up, and then automatically, I mean, again, another point, Billy, is that this is one of my students who brought this text to the class. It wasn't me. So it was brilliant because it was really an opportunity for me to be like, this is a fantastic text. Let's all analyze it together right now. And when we started to do it, we could see all of this emerging. And all I'm pointing them to is this oppositional clustering that's emerging, which they're all very well aware of. They're being told constantly through the media. And I think COVID-19 is presenting a really interesting opportunity there. They're constantly being told, look, there are different ways of seeing the world. And the way that we're doing things is working, and our way of life, our communitarian way of life, is the reason why we have a low number of cases, very well controlled, very high rate of vaccination, etc. So students are aware that this discourse exists. But yes, it is a little bit sneaky. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell my bosses. All right. I think we're all doing that. It's a really interesting context to work in, actually, where we're kind of coming up against all of these different ways of viewing the world and just making students aware of that. I mean, all of them are in arts, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, there are some amazing critics, and they're already working with all of these kinds of texts. So that's really useful as well. Am I showing you guys the presentation again? Are you back on the, or are you all reading my email and checking out my book?
You were on the presentation, now you've gone again.
I was. Okay, so here we go. All right, so I'm just going to quickly talk you through this because I need to get to the next presentation. And let me just show you how, as this, okay, so that is pretty much all I do with my students. Intuitively, they can understand how that works. So then after that, I would nudge them towards a little bit of technicality. So I would say, okay, let's look at this. What we see is, overall, we see judgment, 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 and all of those judgments are towards one single target. So we have a massive cluster developing there of negative judgment of the Singaporean woman who is initially identified as the woman who didn't wear the mask. And then we've got negative, negative, negative judgments, and she starts to become associated over time with a movement in the US. So then I asked the students, okay, what kinds of meanings are joining together? This woman, a movement in the US, all right, and certain sort of Western values are being contrasted against, we have that dichotomy emerging. So the student himself, in his assignment, when he did this activity, pointed out the individualism, communitarianism dichotomy, and the way in which the woman is being associated with a way of life and a set of beliefs that don't align with what's valued in Singapore. And her transgressive actions are considered a part of that system of belief. And therefore, it's interesting that rather than just she's a person who's not wearing a mask, she becomes a person who's not wearing a mask who is another, and that other is associated with not being nationalistic in the Singaporean sense. So she's rejected in terms of the fact that her beliefs don't align with Singapore as a nation. So not considered the kind of individual who's willing to sacrifice their own comfort, for instance, for the betterment of their community. So if Ken Tan is here, of course, this overlaps with much of his work on nationalism and nations and community building. And so I'm sure Ken can see that at this point, what we have is an interesting set of meanings associated with Gemeinschaft, or the us and them that emerge in nationalistic discourse sort of coming up. Okay, so I am going to finish there. I'm just going to show you a few things that my students have done in class as a result. So the students they analyzed the SARS poster, they analyzed previously Australian climate change discourse, and they looked at the different ways in which these texts, this is the students' actual work from the Google Docs in the classrooms. They actually create these tables, these amazing tables, and then over time, we analyze these tables for the kinds of clusters that form and how they eventually form different constellations. So I guide the students through the questions the same way that I did with you: find instances of positive, negative meaning, bold, underline, anything that is a person or a thing that's being evaluated, then put it into the table. Then I ask, are there any things that are being repeatedly evaluated? So the woman who's not wearing the mask, repeatedly evaluated. And then I ask questions about, is it positive or negative meaning that's associated with that person? And then after that, I ask, is anything that we read in class that helps you understand the way in which this constellation is forming, and then helps you see how it aligns to other constellations, or there's an underlying cosmology or of meanings that are emerging here that can help you explain through theories of nations and nationalisms what's happening in this text and why it's skewing towards particular types of nationalism. And that's how I would basically structure this talk. So I'm just going to stop sharing now. Mark is going to go actually next, so I'm going to let him take over for the rest of the session. Thank you so much, everyone. I will come back and then give you a little taster of what Laetitia does with curriculum design in EAP, and then we have a little question answer session, and we can just chat towards the end. We have about half an hour after our sessions, our next two sessions are over, and then you can ask us any questions that you have. Please feel free to type them up on the chat as well, and I'll get back to them later. Okay, Mark, you can just start if you like.
Thanks, Namali. Okay, so I'll just open up my PowerPoint. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Nam, for that. I think you'll all agree that it's a very interesting way to use clusters in the classroom. So over several years now, I've been working with semantic gravity in the classroom with students, and I really find it's very applicable for pedagogical purposes. This is something that I think is a real game changer, as it says in our title, and powerful praxis. I haven't found that's always the case with other theories. You know, there have been times when I've had issues using SFL in the classroom, trying to get STEM students to understand, you know, in a short period of time. The meta language can sometimes be a bit tricky. But with semantic gravity, I found that students really relate to it very quickly, and it can be very practical. So that's what I'll be sharing with you today. So as Namali said,
can I just say, yeah, Mark, can I just jump in and say, it's really nice to hear that, because I was reading a blog by somebody who doesn't understand the difference between everyday words and technical words recently, that was attacking LCT for having terms like semantic gravity and saying there's no way that any student can understand this or engage with this at all. So it's useful to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, once they get past the idea that you're talking about, gravitational pull and the moon, because they're scientists, once they get over that idea, they're absolutely fine with the linguistic analysis. Yeah. No, there's hardly any issues at all and I've been doing this for probably over 5 years now with classes, and I've been using it at all sorts of levels. From the most elementary levels, guiding students who have real difficulties writing in English, to very advanced levels where we're talking about, published papers. And I've never had any issues with it at all. With regards to
thanks for letting us know. I think it's really important because the people who like to think of themselves as sort of standing up for the average Joe or Jane or whatever are actually, I think, really dismissive of the capacity of students to understand technical terms and just treat them like they're idiots, thinking, well, if it's got a slightly complicated name, they won't be able to understand it. And I think that's true of teachers as well. So nice one.
Yeah, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle, isn't it? You're really setting the students up there to be dunces, aren't you? If you start off with that as a philosophy. Yeah. So if anyone hasn't tried it before, then please do so, because students understand semantic gravity very quickly. So this is the module title, and I've been teaching this now for probably about six years at NUS, and we're exploring socialization processes. So particularly related to sport participation, sports involvement. So we look at ways that people are involved in sport to start with, reasons why they drop out of sport, and then identity construction through sport, which is probably the largest element of the module, because we can talk a lot about different demographic features like people with disabilities or ethnicities, classes, etc. So there's a lot of scope there for discussion and research. So the way that I've been using semantic gravity quite a lot recently is really getting students to think about a theory that they can apply for their research design. And then after that, to collect data and analyze the data using that theoretical perspective. And you can imagine that the students, haven't done this before, because it's really a new subject to them to analyze sport academically. A lot of what I mentioned earlier, a lot of the students come from the STEM faculties and have, very rarely explored sociological notions. And so the idea in our program is that the students are given, through a residential academic program, they're given a kind of holistic development. And so it kind of draws on the liberal arts notion in American universities of a holistic development of the student. So if they are producing engineers, they want to produce engineers who know a little bit more about the world than just their faculty and just their studies. So that's really the kind of attitude I think that the program has. And, they want to produce students who can go abroad into international settings and converse about subjects, and connect to others, not just bookworms. So my idea is to try to bring sport to the students from a cultivated gaze perspective. And so I'm sharing with you the classroom activities that I have written in the chapter that Namali and Esther have edited, and that book, The Demystifying Critical Reflection. And so what I'm talking about really is trying to move students' awareness from a kind of football yada yada perspective, where the obvious is stated every Friday night at the bar, to a more kind of academic gaze, where you're actually exploring how perhaps discrimination or empowerment is related to sport participation. And so in the chapter, thanks to Namala's guidance, I draw on Brooke critical reflection and his definitions of it. The idea that being critical should really be related to looking at power inequities, not just being able to evaluate something, but look at it with regards to its social justice elements. And so really this is what I'm trying to explore with my students with this gaze. And as I said, a lot of them are STEM students, so they come from a positivist background. And so any form of qualitative research seems quite odd to them to start with, but that's what I really ask students to do. I don't mind a mixed method, but I also want some form of qualitative research. So maybe critical discourse analysis, or maybe going out into the social field, doing observations, interviews, that sort of thing. And so it's really essential for these students to see how abstract concepts are used to explore empirical contexts. And in my field, we talk about the 5 grand theories. These are umbrella terms that have many sub-theories under them. But to start off the module, because the students are very new to this, I explore these 5 theories. So these are functionalist, conflict, feminist, interactionist, and critical theories. And like I said, there are many, Goffman, Cooley, fall under the interactionist frame, Foucault, Gramsci fall under the critical theory frame, feminist, there are all sorts of shippers, all sorts of theorists that fall under all of these umbrella terms. So what we do is we try to, I try to expose students to the concepts that relate to those, and try to guide them through the process of actually being able to explore them as lenses to analyze an empirical context. And so to start with, generally, I just show students the well-known definition of what semantic gravity is. And then after that, try to relate it to subject matter in my module. So giving them several examples like this one, where we talk about weaker semantic gravity and stronger semantic gravity. So asking students to, think about critical race theory and the types of concepts that relate to that, like color blindness, social channeling, racial stacking, and then to think about how somebody like Colin Kaepernick might relate to those concepts. So Kaepernick, of course, was famous for the Bended Knee campaign and speaking out against color blindness. So this notion is that there are so many Black African Americans in sport like NFL or the NBA that it makes people think that it's a meritocratic society and that this ethnic group is perhaps very successful. And perhaps because we see so much exposure to these successful athletes, we might think that in the rest of society in the US, this ethnic group is not subjected to discrimination. And so concepts like color blindness can be explored. The ideas of racial stacking is the condensation of a particular ethnic group in a sport. And then social channeling is the idea of significant others pushing, as well as the media, pushing people into that context. And so we can explore concepts like this, and we can try to look for examples of people who have experienced or talked about it. So this really helps students to understand this difference between weaker and stronger semantic gravity. And after that, we talk about profiles, and I get students to tell me what these profiles might be and to define the profiles. And I give them texts and we explore that. And I think, after a couple of lessons, students really have the idea of what semantic gravity is and what semantic ranges are and what semantic gravity profiles are. So we can work from there using examples with texts. So I told you that very often students start off without this cultivated gaze. And this is actually a an example of a student's theoretical framework about 6 weeks into a module when they're getting together a research proposal. And what you can see, this was before I started doing semantic gravity profiles with my students. This was probably one of the pushes that really, I said to myself, you know, I need to work on this. What can I use? And if you look at this text from a student, you can see that the voice, it's really like a journalistic type text. It's very descriptive. It's very the here and now. It's very context dependent, and very little conceptual ideas are brought into it. We're told that pressure is part and parcel of competitive sport. So pressure, being, you know, being pressured, this could be a conceptual idea. And then at the end, we're told that choking can occur due to pressure. So here we have concepts like pressure and choking because of high stakes competition. But, you know, I'd show my students, read this and, you know, tell me, if you're using semantic gravity, what kind of profile can you see here? And so, you know, they're very straightforward on this. It's very descriptive. It's a low flat line. There's hardly any conceptual underpinning to the text. So normally there's no issue with this. Another example that I had before I started using semantic gravity was this from a student. And, you know, to me, it shows another profile which is quite common in students writing when they're not, you know, used to writing in this way. And so this was about feminism, empowerment, and the gender outlook, particularly a female bodybuilder. But what you can see here is a text that brings up several conceptual notions, but doesn't unpack them. So here we've got hardly any context in comparison to the last text. And if I ask my students what's going on here, you know, they can quite easily say it's a high flat line. They say that the student needs to unpack these terms. Okay, they don't call it a disconnected high flat line. That's my own take on it, in that the concepts are not even linked to each other in meaning. But they're very happy to say, you know, this is a high flat line, there's no unpacking. So after this, I can move on and I can say, all right, well, you know, what are we seeing here? We're seeing low flat lines and high flat lines. What we need to do is try to find the middle pathway as well. We need to connect these two, you know, oppositional areas. And of course, there are many meanings in between as well, but, you know, I'm using this for pedagogy at the moment rather than research. So I like to show students about this in a fairly simplistic way to start with. So we talk about entry points and we talk about upshifts and downshifts, and this is so that we can start thinking about those differences in meaning with regards to context dependency. And so what I've done is I've developed a process of input, and you'll see the stage 5, the 5 stages at the end. It's also in the chapter. And so you know, we've looked at low flat lines and high flat lines. And now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show students how you can connect between the more abstract and the more concrete. So in this text, this is a typical teacher text that I would use. I would give the text to students as well to read and, you know, maybe read it through for them or maybe just summarize it. And so, you know, there are particularly 2 concepts here that I'm trying to get students to focus on. So I'll give you a couple of moments to read it. So we explore Merton, we explore Durkheim, we talk about notions like deviance, and we talk about notions like the organic solidarity. And so these are very important terms in sport. you've got doping and all the problems that we've had with doping. And so that kind of breaks away from the Olympic consciousness. And so a functionalist would look at doping as a deviant activity. And so what I'm showing to my students here is I'm saying, you know, I'm coming in at a fairly low level of abstraction here, because I'm talking about notions like belief systems, codes of conduct, not following norms. These are terms that students are aware of. Deviance, you know, they've heard of the term, but they're not aware that it's a whole academic focus for functionalists. And then we can see how the organic solidarity is brought in this text as well. So, you know, we're starting at fairly, you know, low technical terminology, and then bringing it in from a functionalist perspective. Deviance and organic solidarity are very important notions for functionalists. And so I show them the text, and I provide a figure like this to show how the language relates to the terms. So here's a second text that I'd like to share. I just need to change the font there a minute. Sorry about that. Yeah. So yeah, so this is a second text that I've used as a scaffold for teaching as well. So here we're looking more at the idea of downshifts. So here we're starting off with interactionist theorists, and we're talking about intersubjectivity. And then after that, female interactionists, feminist interactionists are quite interested in stigmatization as well. And so here we're looking at downshifts, and so asking students what terms they think, you know, might be related here to mixed gender football as an empirical context. And they're quite happily saying, you know, these concepts, toxic masculinity, intersubjectivity, stigmatization, all of these concepts can be related to women's experiences in mixed gender football. And so again, this is helping students to see how the empirical can be explored with an abstract concept. And so, you know, after that, we can start going into the waves a bit more. So this is the student's text after semantic gravity input, the one about the female bodybuilder. And so she, you know, realized that she needed to help to link abstract and concrete. And in this text, that's what she's doing. She's talking about hegemonic femininity. She's unpacking it to say that, you know, it's, here she's saying it's a critical feminist approach. She's talking about hegemonic masculinity, which, you know, is male practices that promote the superior social position of men. She's talking about female bodybuilder transcending boundaries. So she's linking concepts and unpacking and defining them as she goes, and really creating a semantic gravity wave. And so here you can see those concepts and how they're unpacked. So once they get the idea of these differences in abstraction, they can quite easily use them. Again, this is that example about the pressure choking in ego-oriented athletes. And here we can see that the student is bringing much more related to abstract terms. So we have a for example here, but before that, you know, we're talking about ego-oriented players, talking about proving themselves, talking about constantly demanding from teammates. So these are more kind of generalizable notions. And then bail is used as an example. After that, the student goes back to talk about ego orientation, underperforming, selfishness, and a cycle of underperforming. So again, you can see these shifts. And once students have really understood this in their own writing, we can start using published texts. This is an example from a 215 paper by Stewage in a sport journal, which is describing habitus. And I ask students to look at the text and fill in a box like this. So, you know, now that they're getting into being able to recognize the abstract concepts, you know, that can be used to explore empirical contexts, then they're starting to see which concept is unpacked or which concept is, you know, defined or exemplified. And so with a text like this, I can ask them to fill in those boxes. You know, which words do you think relate to social arena? Which words do you think relate to embodied schemes of practice? Which concept relates to behavior in a sports club? And students can tell me, oh, it's field, it's habitus, specific volume and composition of capital. So now they're seeing much more complex texts as we're moving on. And I just wanted to finish off by, you know, showing you a text that was written by one of my students. And the student, to go with the text, I asked him to produce a semantic gravity profile. And this is what he gave me. So third wave or choice feminism, good mother and athlete, cognitive choices, strong and assertive, hegemonic masculinity, strength and confidence, hierarchy, dominant male gender, hegemonic femininity, gentle and dependent, pariah, non-conformity femininity, othering, too strong, self-empowerment, challenge gender norms. So this is the figure that the student produced from his theoretical framework. And so you can really see how it's helped to develop the cohesion in the text and how it's helped the writer to really write for a reader who might not know a lot about the subject matter, because you're unpacking, you're exemplifying, you're defining all the time here. So I'll give you a few minutes to read the text on Serena Williams. I still have 3 minutes left, so I'll give you that time. So I asked the student, I interviewed him afterwards, and I said, you know, what was the benefit of looking at semantic gravity profiling for this? And he said, he's an engineer. He said in his discipline, they're constantly told that they need to write for an audience that might not know the subject matter. And so to write so that the reader can understand you know, the academic intentions of a text as well. And so he said that that was one of the main takeaways that he got. And I wasn't expecting that, but this notion of unpacking concepts through defining or exemplifying is something that he said was a real takeaway from using semantic gravity for pedagogy. He also said, of course, that it gave a lot of insight into how to make a text cohesive. And so this is one of the main reasons why I started using semantic gravity, because it really gives students a discourse perspective on a text. And I've used it for much larger texts as well across IMRD sections. But just for a theoretical framework section and a 30-minute presentation, I think you can see that for a particular text, I mean, they were asked to write 2,500 words. So normally the theoretical framework is about 500 words, or 300 to 500 anyway, depending on the paper. But you can really see how the student has drawn on semantic gravity for cohesion as well in the text, which is something that I've always found difficult to teach, you know, and I think that this gives it a really nice, easily accessible method for students. Yeah, so the 5 stages you'll see in the chapter, you know, if we have some time, perhaps you'd like to talk about it as well. I see there have been lots of statements in the chat. All right, so yeah, thanks Nam.
Thanks, Mark. So just to give everyone a little bit of break from just us talking, if anyone has any questions that they asked on the chat or they'd like to ask again in case I missed anything, I think I've been responding to some people, but maybe not everyone. I think this would be a good time to just have a quick chat and just see if anyone has anything, and then I will be presenting on the last part. So I'm presenting on behalf of Laetitia. Is that Billy who's got his hand up?
Hi, hello again. Sorry, I'm really interested in this, and I mean, I can see lots of other people are, but I'm presuming in a sense that you work a lot with semantic gravity, because at some level you're assuming that, or you can assume that your students kind of have a handle on the semantic density of the language. And yeah, that's one of the things I really struggle with, is that developing the technicality and the semantic density, yeah, in their field, as a, you know, not even going into LCT.
So I mean, shall I take this one now? Yeah. So
yeah,
actually, in a talk that Daniel O'Sullivan did recently, he said about how you know, stronger semantic gravity doesn't necessarily equate to stronger semantic density. And so someone like Colin Kaepernick, you could say, is an extremely dense subject matter because of his life history. So to bring them both in at the same time, I think might be confusing. I haven't done that before. I've used them separately. So I've said you can look at how dense the meaning is in this compared to this. But what I'm trying to do when I'm using semantic gravity as a tool to teach theoretical framework sections, is trying them to see that these concepts are building blocks for theories, and that every theoretical framework has a set of these concepts as a toolkit, and that they can be used to, you know, different theories can have different takes on empirical contexts. So they can see that quite easily, you know, using semantic gravity. I tend not to bring them together, but I have later on as well talked about densities of meanings, but to bring them both in, I think might confuse personally in my context.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, here's Daniel. Daniel's a new member of LCT Singapore because he's just moved here.
Hi. Sorry,
hey.
I'm late.
That's okay, that's fine. Everyone's making dinner and it's just craziness because everyone's from all over the world and just different things are happening. Sometimes I look at something on the program and I like really want to join that, but you know, it's at 1 o'clock in the morning. And we're just actually, me, Mark and Laetitia, we just started the semester last week. So it's a really busy time for us.
It looks like an amazing conference over the next 3 days, and yeah, I think there'll be lots of. Am I going to get up at 2 in the morning to listen to this, or maybe I'm not sure.
You might be up anyway with the baby, so.
Oh, exactly. Hi, Gina.
All right, so I'll just let you think a little bit about any more questions that you might want to ask Mark. I'm going to go on to Laetitia's presentation, so I'm presenting on her behalf today. And then maybe if you have any questions after that, we've got about half an hour. Just, it would be lovely to see some of you who are here and just to chat and say hello. There are lots of colleagues from all over the world some of whose names I'm familiar with and some who I've met before but haven't met for a really long time, especially because, you know, with the pandemic, we haven't been able to go to conferences, etc. So bear with me for the next half hour. And then we'll just have a little bit of time to catch up and ask questions and yeah, and just socialize a little bit before you go on to, I think it's the Nordic, LCT Nordic network who are doing the next session. So before you go to a completely different part of the world. All right, so I'm just gonna go back to sharing my screen. And I am going to try not to inexpertly muddle some excellent work in English for academic purposes. So I guess to a certain extent, me, Mark, and Laetitia, we kind of all work in English for academic purposes, academic literacy. But just as Carl was talking about technicality and technical terms and how people sometimes say, you know, LCT is too technical, you can't use so many technical terms with your students. And I think a lot of you were asking me this question as well after I finished. Do I introduce the concept of axiology? Do I talk about it as axiological clusters and talk about concepts of constellations and actually give students those kinds of more technical texts to read? I certainly do. Our students are very much capable of handling it. And also it's you know, how much you want to introduce to the classroom. So in terms of EAP curriculum, so I'm just going to be talking about how Laetitia, we're taking a slightly different perspective, which is how does she apply semantic waves to look at cumulative learning in English for academic purposes. So this is her, and she's apologizing, saying she can't be here. She's co-coordinating this unit called Creating Narratives, in which we're also using LCT, looking at unpacking technicality and communicating knowledge of disciplines like design and engineering. And I think one thing that I find really interesting and useful about LCT is you can apply it to a whole new discipline, which is not something that you're familiar with. And it's always really fun to see the experts in that discipline sort of being, you know, surprised at what we can show them about their own discipline, and also being able to add to our knowledge. And then we create these amazing texts that we can use in our own teaching. So that's what we're working on at the moment. So she's teaching that unit right now, which is both exciting and scary because I need to teach that soon as well. So looking at the concept from curriculum perspective. So when you are developing curriculum, I think this is very challenging for all of us. I mean, me and Mark have just been talking about specific activities that we use in the classroom to address specific problems that we see in our students' writing, but obviously looking at designing the entire curriculum and how you would justify the concept of transfer. So what kinds of meanings are your students taking from English for academic purposes, and what you're teaching them about language, for instance, in this instance, to other units beyond is quite a challenging question to answer, I think. So for many of us, I always try to tell my students, all of the concepts I'm teaching you are applicable to your own disciplines in different ways. And Laetitia had to teach a very large EAP unit in which she was doing exactly this, which is she was asking this question about EAP for transfer. So the first thing that she looked at was the literature, and she was talking about how the literature is difficult to understand. It's difficult to plan with. There's no measure of transfer because it's predominantly a knowledge blind environment. So in EAP, there's different views of how to use knowledge about language, if at all, and those multiple different ways of looking at language. And also sometimes not explicitly talking about what you're actually teaching in the classroom can make trying to access all of the theories about transfer quite I think, quite difficult to understand and also to implement in the classroom. And I think something that Mark, Laetitia, and I have done right throughout our careers, especially with working with LCT and Daniel as well, is not only just to look at the concepts, amazing concepts of something like LCT allows us access to, but think about how they actually work in the classroom. How are they useful in the classroom for teaching our students about how they can deal with text? So a lot of the transfer literature in EAP, transferring linguistic knowledge from English for academic purposes courses to the students' own disciplinary fields, they tend to be perception-based studies. So a lot about what the students think that they learned. The knowledge is unspecified. So, there's no specific understanding of what is being taught. It's called EAP module content, and it's taken for granted that there is a general understanding of what constitutes an EAP module. And then language is not defined. So for instance, there's generally an ontology of being generative, formal grammar with a twist of EAP. So there might be some discussions about things like genres and moves perhaps, but there isn't much sort of digging down to the specific instances of language and looking at grammar and discourse semantics and how all of those kinds of resources work in the kinds of texts that you show your students. So Laetitia wanted to answer this question of how to enable EAP transfer, and she was interested in looking at the specific context of a large general EAP course, so English for general academic purposes. So she was teaching one of those core curriculum courses with, I think, something like 700 students from the Faculty of Science, which has multiple disciplines. And then the question is, how much of what we're teaching them can they transfer across in academic writing that they do within their own fields? The big question being, is teaching them general, English for academic purposes knowledge something that is a waste of time? And she says it isn't if we plan purposefully and think about that content that we use in the curriculum in a purposeful way. And she uses semantic gravity to do this, to show how she tries to use some of the more abstract concepts in knowledge about language within the classroom as particular instances, and then allowing the students to have a toolkit of knowledge that they can then use and apply in their own disciplines and their own fields. So in looking at semantic gravity, so you are all aware of semantic gravity, meanings related to context, relative context dependency of meaning, many of the concepts that Mark was talking about before. Weaker semantic gravity is abstract realms. And in terms of knowledge about language, the more abstract concepts that are relevant across multiple different fields. So meta language, essentially. So for instance, do you call something weaker in semantic gravity, and then do you give your students that meta language that they can apply across multiple fields and multiple types of language? And then stronger semantic gravity about being concrete realms, instantiation, so knowledge that is more specific and relevant to a precise context. And she says that meaning can be in a curriculum, a lesson, a classroom interaction, a student essay. So some of the useful concepts that are used: semantic range, high flatline, low flatline, and semantic waves. Many of these things which you are all familiar with, both because Mark just presented on it, but now we're going to be looking at that in relation to how was that applied when Laetitia tried to create and develop curriculum resources for a very large English for general academic purposes unit. With multiple tutors, I think that was another challenge that she faced. All of the teachers that all of the tutors within the course, very few of them knew systemic functional linguistics or had any knowledge about language. They usually come from a understanding of English for academic purposes as being about how to read a text, and a lot more intuitive, a lot more sort of commentary-based analysis of text based on their own individual knowledge rather than being a systematic approach through linguistics. Okay, so when she applies semantic gravity to the EAP curriculum, she's talking about knowledge about language in EAP. So abstract entities, weaker semantic gravity is systemic functional linguistics and abstract entities within that. and then realizations in discourse is stronger semantic gravity as specific examples from systems in the discourse. So we're looking at language as a system of resources to make meaning. So this is the particular type of knowledge that she's trying to convey to her students. So not thinking of it as a set of rules in the mind. So, moving away from the error correction type teaching that sort of is predominant, I think, in language classrooms, or, sort of native speaker models, etc. She's moving more towards language as meaningful. So making choices from this system, so introducing a particular system to students, a very abstract system sometimes, the kinds of meta language that me and Mark have been using in relation to, axiological clusters or semantic gravity, but then thinking about, showing students how to use these kinds of resources and apply them to different fields, and according to context such as discipline, exploring purpose, audience, and awareness of what the best choices are from this system for a particular purpose. So starting from the basis of systemic functional linguistics, which is the approach that she teaches in the classroom, thinking about the three functions or three meta functions of language, which is enacting social relations, talking about field, and then finally how are texts organized. So how does she try and operationalize some of this? So I'm just going to show you an example that she uses. So this idea that there are very abstract terms and meta language that are being introduced to students, but then providing them the opportunity to work with multiple texts and see realizations in disciplinary discourse really allows them to operationalize, practice these concepts, see how they work in real texts, and then also build up enough confidence and knowledge to then be able to apply it outside. So when they are writing their own text, just the way that Mark showed, the student starts with being taught what semantic gravity is, then they can apply it to their own texts when they're writing their text to see how effective their own writing is and how well they convey meaning as they do that. So the academic writing toolkit that she uses moves through genre, which is purpose and staging, then goes on to talk about creating a cohesive text, expressing logical relations, expressing the field, so packing dense and precise meanings from your field into a text, and then finally looking at evaluation, persuasion, and stance. So these kinds of systems are abstract, lots of meta language, lots of concepts to learn. And of course, the challenge is trying to unpack that, make it stronger in semantic gravity, give the students concrete realizations so that, and an opportunity to practice those concrete realizations, and to see how they move across in relation to different types of disciplinary contexts and genres and phases of texts. Okay. So what does this look like in a teaching sequence? So how do you take really abstract concepts, and we're looking specifically at evaluation in this instance, and then how do you show the students how to apply these to their own, to different texts from different disciplines, so that you start to build up their confidence with using this knowledge about language to analyze texts, and then think so that they can then transfer that across to their own discipline. So kind of similar to the work that me and Mark were talking about as well. So it's interesting because all of us have very similar approaches, but we use multiple different activities. We share these activities amongst each other in LCT Singapore, and also with members of our other staff in our Center for English Language Communication at NUS. So a lot of these concepts from LCT are sort of filtering down to the center, and people are starting to use these concepts a lot in their own teaching. So this is basically showing you how the entire curriculum cycle would work, like for instance, within a single lesson, or within over time, how you start to introduce systems and then give them more sort of weaker, stronger in semantic gravity examples of how those systems are operationalized, and then discuss disciplinary variation. So I'm going to show you an example of how Laetitia does this in the classroom. So she'd start with overview of meaning, intended, and the systems, guided analysis in one text, analysis of different disciplinary texts, and then discussion. So sort of gently scaffolding the students through the process of, introducing them to a lot of technical language in linguistics, but then guiding them through the activities so that they start to see how they're used and how becoming aware of those kinds of knowledge about language allows them to have a better awareness of the text, both in terms of when they're reading, as well as when they're writing their own texts. So one of the questions that she's asking, so this is an example of a task that you give students. So how do we argue or debate in different disciplines? And if we're looking at what she introduces at the top part of her wave as weaker semantic gravities, there'd be resources from a system like engagement in systemic functional linguistics, simplified for the purpose of letting students immediately apply these concepts to a text. So the system of engagement is referenced to other sources. So are there multiple voices in the text, and how are the relationships between those multiple voices played out? And then attitude, which is opinion and emotions about different targets. So the students are actually introduced to concepts like modality in the classroom. So you might introduce to students, modality could be the use of such modal verbs as may, might, etc. And then there's ways in which using modality, the author of that particular text can either distance themselves from somebody who they are, somebody whose theory or concepts they're discussing, or they can align or agree or endorse them. And then finally, are there positive or negative evaluations and charging of targets? So when they are arguing for one particular theory, one particular idea or concept being better than others, and giving and trying to persuade their audience what are some of the different types of language resources that they use. So the task would be highlight and compare these resources that are used to argue in these three texts. So I'm going to show you what those three texts are. So the texts are the actual instances of how these kinds of meanings are used within the discourse to argue a particular position. And then the students will be asked to discuss the disciplinary differences. So what are there similarities and differences in terms of how each discipline operationalizes these different tools? So students are given an opportunity to discuss that after they've finished highlighting the text and they have identified the specific types of modality, engagement resources, and evaluation that are used. Okay, so this is the first text, all right? So this is Wish Because Why Are There No Color Universals in Language and Thought? So students are really getting into very complex texts, okay? This is not a case of saying, okay, so this is the EAP classroom, let's give them simplified text. This is actually giving them sort of journal articles in different disciplines, getting students to start thinking about very complex concepts and comparing them across in different disciplines. So I'll just let you have a little look through that text before I show you how students marked it up, and let you see what kinds of resources that were introduced initially, like modality and positive and negative evaluation, are used in these texts. So I'm just going to give you a minute to have a look through. Okay, so you can see here that Wishbigger is arguing that, she's basically arguing for a particular position in how you explore the concept of color in different cultures. And you can see she's using a lot of language. This basic point, which I have been making for many years, often rejected on the basis of the axiom that the absence of a word does not prove the absence of a concept. So she is trying to persuade the reader that the concept of color universals is something that they need to consider from her particular perspective in relation to semantics. So she brings in different meanings of color in different languages, whether or not they have a word for it. And so she's building up her argument here. So in this text, the students would go about, for instance, maybe, and this is, as you can see from the top there, the targets are bold underlined, and then you've got evaluation highlighted in yellow, engagement highlighted in gray, and then modality highlighted in green. So you can see that students, as they are moving through, similar to the text that I showed in the first activity on axiological clusters, students are just going through highlighting, and you can talk them through that particular activity or wait for them to finish and report back into the entire class. Just the fact that students are showing their capacity to identify these kinds of meanings, even if they're doing it to a certain extent intuitively, depends on how much information you want to give them in terms of what kinds of resources are being used. But even intuitively, students can start to pick up on the basic evaluative meaning, self-contradictory. There can be no universals, basic point I've been making for years. This supposedly does not prove a lexical gap, convenient axiom invoked in support of. So you can see all of the evaluative meanings, and of course modality as well up the top. Engagement, all of the different positions, people entering into the text in forms of different participants. So you've got different academic researchers coming in, Bulmer 1968, and what he says about color, and then we've also got Levy 1973. So this is just an example of how the students might start to look at a text in anthropology. They would do the same in another discipline as well. So you would introduce, for instance, the concept of color, Pretty in Pink, the early development of gender stereotype color preferences in psychology, and you would have a similar kind of activity. So the students are given a short text where the authors are arguing what the gaps are in the research, gender-based color preferences, biological basis. Some researchers have proposed that evolutionary advantage for women, whether or not pink is something that's determined by gender. Something that deeply distresses me as a mother of a young daughter. And I'm sure Mark would feel the same. Okay, so the idea of whether or not females have a biological disposition to favor colors pink. So again, we have this kind of text highlighted. So you can spend a little bit of time seeing the highlights here. Students are looking at particular targets, all right? So current findings are evaluated as inconsistent with. You can see a lot of modality entering into this text, suggests, may, and you can see similar, lots of engagement in terms of other positions, inborn preference for colors such as pink. You've got Alexander, Herbert, and Ling. And then of course you've got things like negation, do not support, right? A modality should be evident regardless, did not emerge. There's a lot of different types of meaning that are coming together to create the persuasive element in this text and to build the arguments that the author is putting forward, the propositions that the author is putting forward. So we can see similar resources used across two very different disciplines. And then we have, and I was horrified to see this, applied physics, an entirely different discipline coming in, right? And of course, here we have an interesting, another interesting discussion about dichotomies, as Carl was mentioning in his plenary this morning, which is how do you differentiate between physics versus anthropology? And most people would say there's such, diverse fields that, the way you argue in them, you don't use similar kinds of resources. But of course, here you can see, and I will just show you the highlighted text, that there are different ways in which there's an element of persuasion coming in. So contrasting two different theories and bringing in other ways of using resources such as engagement, instances of modality is suggestive, is likely to be. So, these are one of those things that you tell your students, it's sciences, there's no use of modality because, you have 100% in a proposition, you make a case and that's it. With experimental data, there's no sort of in between. And then that's not the case, especially when students start to see that there may be less use of certain resources, but doesn't mean that they completely, these kinds of resources in argumentative texts where someone is trying to argue for a particular position don't exist. So the next point, which, in the classroom, how do you then go about saying, okay, now we've got all these instantiations, we've got all the weaker semantic gravity in the sense that we've looked at how these concepts work in texts from different disciplines. What does that mean for discussion and analysis? So here we are starting to think about, okay, how can we use these concepts and transfer them to other disciplines? So one of the things that you'll notice is that students might point out things like debunking of certain fallacies. So this idea that there's no I in academic writing is objective and neutral, certainly the case in sciences, the concept of neutrality, but in fact, you could see that there were certain instances in which if you're trying to persuade your audience of a particular scientific perspective or a theoretical position, how certain resources come in evaluative meanings. So disciplines do different things differently, as shown in different instantiations of the system, in the quantity and type of instantiation. So how much is being used? You can see, for instance, in the LaBouche article on pink and gender preference, there's a lot more use of modality and a lot more use of evaluation, which is considerably dialed down in the applied physics abstract that I showed you, but they still seem to use a lot of common resources, and showing students that commonality is powerful. Even though knowledge building is legitimated differently, it reveals the rules of the games for academic writing across these disciplines. Providing students with that meta language allows them to have a common language of description across different texts. So critical analysis is about revealing the rules. The first step, she says, in subverting them, and the possibility to develop students as critical discourse analysts for beyond academic discourse, so to include media discourse, etc. So allowing them, giving them an abstract, a weaker semantic gravity system, showing them instantiations of it, but then allowing them the possibility of applying it to many other texts across many different disciplines and contexts. And so this is how she talks about cumulative learning. So just to summarize, with semantic gravity weaving out throughout the semester, students are able to transfer applicable knowledge of language, even really complex concepts such as linguistics. They're able to apply those weaker semantic gravity concepts into practice and analysis when you give them opportunities to apply them to texts, which are much more concrete in meaning. The conception of language as context-dependent resource rather than a set of rules in the mind and idealized competence to achieve. So working with authentic texts, allowing students to pull them apart, gives them, a lot more useful knowledge that they can transfer across rather than sort of just a set of rules about grammar, for instance, that they can apply, which is how you would typically, a lot of EAP classrooms would apply knowledge about language as rules. And then finally, the idea of critical awareness of language as a construal of ideology. I love that Laetitia managed to sneak that in there in English for general academic purposes curriculum, where she's subverting ideology by saying and making aware the fact that, the use of these kinds of complex concepts to everyday texts, to instantiations in different ways, is giving students a really powerful tool with which to view the world and view their individual disciplines. So that is me on behalf of Laetitia saying, teaching language for cumulative learning is teaching systemic functional linguistics knowledge, which is weaker in semantic gravity. So applying semantic gravity allows her to think about how she can strengthen semantic gravity by exploring instantiations in a range of disciplinary contexts. And in the field of English for academic purposes, where people will always ask, how much can you introduce technicality? Is it too much? Are your students struggling to be able to say, no, actually they aren't, and they're walking away with a toolkit that they can use from this particular general academic purposes course to their own disciplines in a really useful and powerful way. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks for all your patience. Oh my goodness, we really appreciate all of you being here and helping make our session a success. I know that it's getting late for some of you, but I do want to say, please feel free to ask us some questions now. We're here for the next half an hour, and we would love to hear from you and to see you all. If you are, I don't know, maybe some of you are sort of like lounging about in bed because it's midnight for you. So, if in your PJs or whatever it is, please say hello. Hi, Shobha. Questions? Yes, please, everyone, ask us some questions. Please feel free to ask questions from any of the sessions. That's what we're here to do now. Just have a few discussions about these concepts.
Thank you so much. The presentations, all three presentations were actually very interesting. I apologize if there's interference. I am driving, so apologies for that. I just, you know, especially in this last presentation, I've been battling with this notion of well, English for academic purposes, academic literacies as well, and its discipline kind of specificness, as you know, in conversation then with the kind of generic language tools, as you were suggesting, that needs to be developed. But as you were presenting now, I became more aware that, of course, you know, these false dichotomies, but more aware that there are very few programs, well, certainly at our institution, that has a particular disciplinary way, you know, one that is strongly science, strongly social science kind of. In any one program, reading and writing in English, in academic English, in varying. So how can a curriculum actually develop or empower students to unpack the process of figuring how something is different and then engaging in that? I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay. So
I'm trying to say that they go to physics 1, then they go to a course on Cornerstone or something, you know, like a humanities-based course. And then how could a curriculum for English for academic purposes empower students to identify that these are different spaces and that I need to engage the tools differently? Thank you.
Okay, so you're asking about, you know, giving the students the resources to look at texts in different disciplines. Am I right?
Yeah, but more especially to be able to identify that, hang on, this is different to the last thing I was doing. So how do I provide tools for them to identify the process of seeing that this is different?
Well, okay, I don't know whether Mark wants to say something. I might start and then please feel free. Daniel's also worked in EAP for such a long time, so he might be able to jump in. But I think for me, it's about working with these kinds of authentic texts and giving the students the opportunity to actually start highlighting or just making them aware of a specific, sometimes a very tiny feature of the language that you want them to focus on, and then thinking about how you can compare them across different disciplines. I think that's how I would go about doing it. It means, I think sometimes when you're working with disciplines that are not your own, it means taking a bit of a risk there in terms of what kinds of knowledge you're engaging with. But if you feel confident with the specific linguistic resource that you're using, if you're looking at English for academic purposes, so if you're looking at something like genre and you feel confident with the concept of genre, I think seeing how it's used across different disciplines is more something that you can do more easily. I don't know. Does that make sense? Mark, Daniel?
Yeah, I can say something. So Laetitia, she's published a paper in JEAP on this. She's developed what she calls an instantiation table, which takes a trinocular approach to text analysis and the different kind of linguistic characteristics that can be seen across disciplines. And so this instantiation table can be applied to different texts from different faculties or different genres. So it's kind of a tool that she uses and that she teaches students to use. And so after several activities employing it, they're more able to use it on their own. And so that helps them to notice the differences in use of linguistics across texts and across genres and faculties.
I think another thing that we're often dealing with in EAP is we've often got this double target of knowledge about language and the disciplinary. And I just saw a comment from Ken sort of alluding to that as well. And so, you know, we could switch LCT tools and we could go to autonomy and sort of go, you know, what's our target? I know I've had discussions with lots of people regarding this and how we're often dealing with this double target. So I guess one way is we need to make a decision, you know, we'll try one target, and we'll hit that target. So if we want to work with the language, kind of what Laetitia was just showing, we might be able to look at how these different systems are used across the different disciplines. And I think that was kind of shown in the text. Alternatively, we could flip it and we could say, well, what is it about the content? And we could foreground the content and then sort of have a look at, you know, how is the content presented differently in these different disciplines? And then you might be able to bring in some of your language tools to kind of, I guess it's to equip the students with the tools themselves. You sort of say, look, you've kind of got to have this, you know, ability to switch lenses. So I've often used a lot of metaphors. I showed the example of the two ladies' faces and the lamp kind of thing as well. And I sort of say, you know, depending on the way that you're looking at this, you can see two faces or a lamp. You know, and so I've done this with using, for example, periodicity, looking at a text, and sort of said, okay, these are the two faces, but now let's look at the content. Okay, now this is like you've got to see the lamp as well, and you can sort of show how the complementarity of these two tools gives the students some sort of ability to be able to switch lenses and ultimately equip them with something that they may be able to transfer.
You've just put the links in the chat, haven't you, Nam, to Laetitia's paper, if you want to find out how she applies it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks. So how's everyone doing? Excited about LCT 3.5? I hope we haven't exhausted you. Do we still expect SG plus in teaching abstracts?
What do we mean by teaching abstracts there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Does this mean as in the abstracts of a paper and we're teaching the abstracts of the paper, or does this mean from a curriculum document perspective?
Do we still?
So perhaps contextualizations of theories, that sort of idea. Yeah, okay. So if we can think of, I guess there are different ways you can think about conceptualize semantic gravity as well. So how you operationalize this concept within a particular classroom or a particular way. So in fact, sometimes unpacking the theory could be seen as a way of strengthening semantic gravity. We could also argue that it's also just weakening the semantic density of it as well. But by talking about how this particular theory may have been used in a particular study, okay, or how it's used in a particular source, that could be seen as a strengthening of semantic gravity. So yes, we could see it that way.
I've got a question. Can you hear me?
Jen?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. You're now currently in a kitchen cupboard while I cook, which is why it's got this strange shape.
Oh,
I was just wondering, have you had any problems using LCT as a teaching tool? Do other people have some? I mean, not just want to ask you questions, but also get other people to join in with their experiences. Do they have particular things that work and things that don't work? you'll always get students who have an allergic reaction to certain kinds of concepts. You're never going to get everybody going, oh, that's lovely. So I'd be interested to hear how other people have used, say, for example, semantic gravity, or whatever it might be, in teaching in comparable ways to the stuff that you guys are doing over there, and whether they've had things that really work really well, or whether they've had particular tricks of the trade that they've developed in terms of trying to use this stuff. Because, I mean, there's a lot of craft knowledge in trying to get across this stuff. You know, that it's about, I mean, I'm a big believer in experience and the whole Noah code side of things. I mean, when sometimes, I mean, other Bernstein influenced approaches are pretty negative about anything that's more of a kind of Noah code, and they want everything to be their idealized image of physics, which doesn't exist anyway. And I think there's a lot of teacher craft knowledge, you know, in the classroom right then and there, or, you know, on Zoom right then and there, that where you kind of jump to bring in an example, or how do you guys, you know, do stuff, deal with sort of like students who aren't getting it or aren't engaging with it, and how do other people here deal with that sort of stuff? I mean, it's a very general question that I'm asking, just really interested in how people are figuring out ways of putting this into practice, which really does require that, you know, that kind of sometimes off the top of your head ideas, but things that then become a kind of bag of tricks that are really useful to share around a community. I'll give you an example, right? I'll just give one off the top of my head, which is fairly, just to give you an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about, which is, you know, it's not particularly high level theorizing, but this is really important, which is that, you know, that sense you get when you're doing something that's sort of a little bit generalized, a little bit abstract, a little bit more theoretical, and you can just feel the kind of glazing over of the eyes, or the kind of slightly lost sense of students. If they're in front of you, it's a lot easier. Maybe on Zoom, everyone looks glazed and somewhere else, but you can kind of get that sense of something going on, and you move down to an example, or you start, you know, or when sometimes you get students who are just so desperate to get into the theory, it's hard to keep them down. They're like some sort of gas-filled balloon that just wants to fly up into theory. I mean, like, you know, that a lot of that is just feel for the game inside the classroom. But I find that I'm using semantic gravity in my head, even if I'm not using it explicitly, as a way of then thinking, oh shit, I've lost these people, I need to come down to something. Or, oh Christ, they're really desperately trying to get up, I need to hold them down inside the data for a bit longer, and I need to bring them back down. Do you find that at all? I'm also interested also in the use of, I don't like meta language as a term, but I do, I mean, I'm not anything against it, I just don't use it myself. But it's just, do you also find that with something like semantic gravity, there's two questions, do you find that something like semantic gravity or semantic density, any kind of allergic reaction to that extra technicality? I know that was talked about a little bit before, but, you know, like people saying, oh, I've got to learn all about this stuff, and then you're asking me to learn about this other theory. Do you get any of that?
I think, Carl, with us, I don't know how it's been with Mark, but with my students, especially the science students, I think, who are the hardest to convince when they're in an EAP academic literacy kind of class, they kind of see that they're going, oh, you know, we're going to get the typical sort of, you know, make eye contact when you're giving a presentation or something like that. So when you start to introduce a little bit of technicality, show them how to use it, it really resonates with them. They kind of sit up and they're like, oh, this discipline has some sort of depth to it. You know, they really, I mean, I find that they really respond to it. And even our colleagues, I think, because I find that a lot of higher education teaching research, people are engaging with a lot of abstract concepts. They're not sure how it works in the classroom. You know, you give a name to it, you talk about something like semantics, and then they immediately start to understand, oh, I can apply this straight away. So I don't think I've ever had any, maybe I've just been lucky with my classes. I've never had any bad experiences. And there are students who actually mention in the feedback that they love using semantic gravity, for instance. They'll mention it and they'll say that lesson, this lesson on axiological clusters that I do, I will always get that in my feedback. I loved that lesson. It was in that lesson that I stood up and was paying attention, you know, so they they like it. They feel, you know, it's exciting and that they can use it straight away. So I haven't had that really. I think we're working in a very privileged context in that sense.
I think I'm going to jump in here and say, from what I've spoken to you Singaporeans, you seem very lucky with the level of students you get for EAP. So in my entire EAP experience, you guys are getting like, you're getting like my dream EAP student. Okay.
Yes, yeah, they are unbelievable. They're eager to do all the hard work.
Yeah, so I think within the field of EAP itself, we've got to remind ourselves, or remind everyone else, that there is such a, you know, such a range of students, from kind of perhaps students who are really, really struggling with their English language. Whether we want to use the proficiency or level, whatever. And we're also often dealing with students that are sometimes relatively young, have relatively limited world exposure. And that can often just be a challenge for where they are in terms of how much they know about stuff. Okay, so yeah, I think that's something that within the field of EAP sort of plays a lot. So in my experience, I've never used any of the LCT concepts explicitly. In my mind, I'm often using SG, like I'll be waving in SG with the purpose of trying to build the SD. So if I can say by the end of a lesson, I've built some of the SD, I think that's a really useful goal for me to work with, but I have to be working really hard at the waves up and down. Now, whether I start low and I start with, you know, the examples and then wave up to some sort of conceptual or a metaphor or something like that, and keep working through it, or I start a little bit higher and I start with, you know, the three cut color, you know. So I think that's Anna Vera's sort of suggestion of, you know, blue for, you know, blue sky thinking theory, you know, yellow for the sun or the flowers, and green for the grass looking down, using all these metaphors. And I work really, really hard with this stuff, and I've had a lot of success with it. Look up to the blue. All right, everyone on Zoom, look up, what do you see? You know, look forward, you're looking straight at me. Okay, now look down, and I'm there doing this and all sorts of stuff. But I'm working really hard at just using these things that they can work with. I'm never using the terms SG. I start using wave up, wave down, they get that. But by the end of the lesson, then perhaps I can say, all right, what we have been doing is this. And then I need to recycle it. I need to come back to it and recycle it.
Oh, I feel like I'm really lazy now, because I feel like with our students, it's just a bag of tricks. I just take out the bag of tricks on day one, and they are just like, they're like, yeah, I want to learn that right now. It's just fun because they are ready to handle it, and they don't mind the harder it gets. They want more of it. And you know, sometimes I can just send them 2 readings in the disciplines like that are, I mean, to actual LCT links on the and then they'll just read that and they'll apply it, and they'll come to me and be like, oh, I analyze the text, is that okay, is it working, you know, immediately. So I think we're really but I do know what you mean about having a lot of students who have absolutely no knowledge of the world, in a sense, because we do have 18, 19-year-olds very well protected, you know, living at home with mom and dad. They've never been anywhere. So they've lived very privileged lives because they come to NUS, which is one of the most privileged universities in the country. So they're very, their worldview is very limited. So I think the challenge for us in a CLIL course is in content and language integrated learning is managing the content side of it and having a good balance between the two, because you can get lost in the analytical frameworks, then you have to kind of bring them back to showing how that's relevant and bringing in all the amazing social theories and things that Mark was talking about as well.
I think that's really interesting. There's some comments in the chat, for example, that really illustrate what you said as well, illustrate two kind of points, which is one that you can use. So in knowledge building, in a chapter on praxis, I make a distinction between tacit praxis and explicit practice, whatever I call it. And, you know, where the difference between using LCT without naming LCT and using LCT explicitly, sort of teaching people the tools of LCT. So you can use both. You know, you can design a curriculum, never mention SG, but you find you're using SG and ST to create the curriculum, or you're teaching and you're thinking about it in your head, but you're saying it out loud, or whatever it might be. And then on the other hand, where you teach the tools to students to give them the tools as well. And also the other thing that I think is really interesting, so like Sarah DP has given an example of literally physical movements, and I've seen teachers do things like that. Or I remember Trish Weeks talking about students using hand gestures and noises as well, or deep, middle, and high, and that sort of things to do with semantic, basically on the semantic scale, effectively. And I think that's, you kind of like reinforce something that I was saying in the opening, which is it really does depend upon the context and the problem that you're dealing with and the people in front of you right then, which is why it always, flummoxes and frustrates me that we work in this, well, a lot of this work is in education, not everyone is, but in education, we work with these universal theories and this sort of constant trench warfare between, no, we must do everything this way, no, we must do everything that way, and just swinging back and forward between them. And LCT is completely agnostic about what to do. It just says, here's the tools, you figure it out, you work it out in your problem, in your context. And I think that's really shown by some of these examples in the chat, and also the examples you're giving, is that it empowers people rather than tells them what to do. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, it's very useful with what you're saying. It's very useful to kind of draw on knowledge that people already sort of leverage on, like Schulman, for instance, to just say, oh, okay, so you're talking about Schulman or Dewey. All right, well, here's these concepts and you can apply them to look at the same kinds of things or look at it in more depth. So it's really, with colleagues, I find that often there are a few entrenched positions, and then you can use LC to move them out of that. Whereas students, I find, are remarkably able to, sort of be a blank slate, so come into the classroom and are amazing.
I don't mean to dominate the conversation, but I'll just add one more thing, which is students are there to learn, ostensibly. Teachers are not. So it's not surprising that colleagues are often very resistant to any new ideas, because they often can think that their learning days are over. They're now doing the teaching side of things.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very blessed in that front. I know nothing about anything. So I have nothing but learning ahead of me.
Nordic LCT is ready to go. All right, Mark is leaving because he has a class.
Yeah, I have a class now. Thank you, everyone.
Yes. Yeah, it's
oh, sorry to miss you, Mark.
Yeah, have a great session, guys.
Thank you.